Hello and thank you for joining me on the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and today we are on episode 97 of season 2. Right through military history, every state that has ever confronted an equal or a superior military power has asked the same question. Not how to match that power, but how to neutralize it. How to find that particular asymmetry, the capability, the alliances, the geography that converts the opponent's strength into a liability. One was the relationship with France, Britain's arch-rival, and the second, a strong navy to challenge Britain's hegemony at sea. Together, they made Mysore the only Indian state in the 18th century capable of meeting the British on their own terms. And this episode is a look at another of those steps that brought the two sides closer to those wars, Mysore's navy. But before I get there, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. In the last episode, I established why the collision between Mysore and the British was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of structure. Two expanding powers towards the same interior, the same access points, the same corridors. There was no room for coexistence. Also noted briefly that Hyder's annexation of the Canara coast got him Mangalore, Honnavar and Basavaraja Durga, and it gave Mysore something that it has never possessed before, a real control of a coastline. And with a coastline came the real possibility of a navy. So when that possibility began a reality, it started to change things for Mysore. To understand why Hyder built a navy, it is necessary to understand what it meant in the 18th century to not have a navy. A landlocked state, however powerful it was on land, was always ultimately dependent on coastal powers to move its goods, to receive its imports, and that includes arms and ammunition, and communicate with the wider world. The British understood this perfectly. The Portuguese had understood it, but in their limited way of trying to extort taxes from all the other ships. But for the British, it was a political statement. Their strategy in India was built on maritime domination. Control the sea and you control the terms on which all the other states survive. You decide what comes in, you decide what goes out, and you decide who can speak to whom. Mysore, for all its military strength on the Deccan Plateau, was subject to exactly this kind of a constraint. Its pepper, its sandalwood, its silk, all of these things had to reach foreign markets. Through channels the British could at any moment choose to close. Mysore's diplomatic missions to France, the Ottoman court, the Persian Gulf, all of these things depended on sea routes that the British Navy patrolled. Its arms imports, the French cannon, the European muskets, the technical specialists, all of these things moved by ship. And as long as the British controlled the sea, Mysore couldn't call itself truly sovereign. It was sovereign on the plateau. It was something less everywhere else. So Hyder saw this with a clarity that few Indian rulers of his time possessed. He had watched the Portuguese lose their inland reach when Vijayanagara fell. He had watched the Dutch displace the Portuguese precisely because they were more ruthless at sea. And then he had watched the British displace the Dutch for the very same reason. The pattern was unmistakable. In the 18th century, maritime power was the final arbiter of all other power. So in the same years, the same period that Hyder was rebuilding the fort at Bangalore in stone and establishing the arsenal at Taramangalapete and recruiting French engineers to train his infantry, it was in those years that Hyder was also actively building a navy. The foundation of the Mysore Navy was the coastline itself. And the coastline, as I noted in the last episode, was acquired in 1763 in that campaign that followed Bidanur and the enormous treasury that Mysore came to acquire. The first acquisition was Mangalore. It was the largest and most commercially connected of all the three principal ports I mentioned earlier. Mangalore's harbour was deep enough for significantly sized vessels. Its position on the Arabian Sea gave it direct access to the trade routes that connected the Malabar coast to the Persian Gulf to East Africa and beyond. And Hyder understood immediately that Mangalore was not merely a port, it was more than that, it was a gateway. The next acquisition was Honavar. Honavar sat further north along the coast, at the mouth of the Sharavati River. Honavar's value was less commercial than it was strategic. Control of Honavar meant control of that river corridor into the Malenadu. And that was the highly densely forested upland interior from where the finest teak in the region was harvested. Teak, that was the wood from which the hulls of Indian ships had been built for centuries. Now that Honavar was secured, Mysore had direct access to its own shipbuilding timber without having to depend on any intermediary to cart that wood from one place to another. And the third was Basavaraja Durga. Now, this is a fortified island. It rises from the sea just off the coast of Honavar, and Basavaraja Durga's flat granite summit surrounded by cliffs makes it formidable, and this was Hyder's northern sentinel. It commanded the approach to the Sharavati estuary. Any fleet moving along that section of the coast would have to reckon with Basavaraja Durga first. It was a natural fortress. So Hyder simply recognized what nature had already built, just like all the other Durgas inland on the plateau. So together, these three positions at Mangalore, Honavar and Basavaraja Durga formed a coastal chain. Mangalore as the commercial and naval hub, Honavar as the gateway to the timber forests, and Basavaraja Durga as the defensive anchor of these northern approaches. The fleet that Hyder Ali built was a hybrid, and that is precisely what made it effective. So what Mysore did not attempt to do was blindly replicate some kind of a European navy. That would have been both impossible and unnecessary and mostly ineffective. What Hyder Ali built was a naval force, and ships were designed for the specific conditions of the Indian western coast, and the coast was marked by shallow harbors, seasonal winds, river mouths and backwaters, and that particular pattern of maritime threat. So the smaller vessels that he built to suit this were the galabats. Low, fast, both oar and sail operated craft that could operate in waters too shallow for larger ships. These were ideal for coastal patrols, for intercepting small vessels, for moving men and supplies quickly along the shores. The backwaters around Kundapur, where 5 rivers met before entering the sea, were a natural sanctuary for these craft. They could be hidden in the sandbanks in the vast networks of channels, effectively invisible to any fleet that was operating in open water. And from their hiding places, these small craft could be deployed very quickly, even against much larger ships, to make quick strikes, guerrilla attacks. Alongside these galabats were larger vessels, dhows, armed merchant ships, and eventually brigs and frigates that mounted significant armament. The accounts that came out of that period, contemporary accounts, describe ships of up to 72 guns. So whether the Mysore fleet ever fielded vessels of that size and numbers is somewhat uncertain, but the ambition was definitely real, and the direction was very clear. What gave Mysore's fleet its unusual character was the diversity of men who built and sailed it. Arab traders, very familiar with Persian Gulf routes, Mapila mariners who had worked the Malabar coast for generations, European shipwrights, some hired, some were deserters from East India Company vessels, and they brought knowledge of hull design and rigging that Indian builders had not previously encountered or updated their skills from the early centuries when we built ships. Now, this was not a navy assembled from some sort of single tradition with a single purpose. It was assembled from whatever worked for whatever purpose it was designed for. Hyder Ali was direct about his intentions. He made deliberate efforts to attract skilled shipwrights from Bombay, from Portuguese enclaves, from anywhere that possessed the technical knowledge that he needed. Now, he was not concerned with where that knowledge came from. He was concerned with whether it would build him a ship that could sail and, importantly, could fight. And now for a commercial break, and when I'm back, let's take a look at what purpose this navy served. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
The strategic purpose of the Mysore Navy was threefold, and it's worth being precise about this because the Navy is sometimes described as though it were simply a symbol, a statement of ambition, rather than a practical instrument of power. But what Hyder built with the Mysore Navy should not be dismissed, not lightly, not otherwise, because the Mysore Navy was both a statement of ambition and a practical instrument of power. But it was the practical dimension that mattered the most. The first purpose was commercial. Mysore's most valuable exports, pepper, sandalwood, cardamom, areca nut, had previously moved through channels that the British and the Dutch controlled. Every transaction carried an implicit tax, not a formal one necessarily, but even the knowledge that access to maritime trade should depend on the tolerance of a superior naval power itself was a form of constraint. A merchant from Mysore who could move goods on Mysore ships to Mysore trading partners under Mysore protection was no longer paying that invisible tax and having to look over their shoulders. What's more, the revenue from all this flowed directly into Mysore's treasury, not into someone else's. Hyder had already established trading offices, as we saw before, and these trading offices were called factories in the language of the time, in Oman. They were not just ornamental, ego-driven factories, they were commercial infrastructure of a state that was beginning to think about trade in the way that a sovereign nation with an outlook on the entire world was thinking, not the way a subject or a vassal would think, leaving the larger things up to a bigger power. Mysore wanted to be that bigger power and be an economy for the world. The second purpose that I mentioned, this was military. Arms, ammunition, technical specialists, and naval stores could now be received through Mysore ports without any reference to British permissions. These included the French cannons that trained Hyder's artillery, and the European muskets that supplied his infantry, and the engineers and artificers who ran all the arsenals and the Taramandala factories. All of these things moved by sea. So once again, British controlled the sea, and these imports were potentially interceptable. A Mysore Navy, even a modest one, complicated that calculation for the British enormously. Now, you couldn't say that the Mysore Navy could match the British fleet, but it could raise the cost of interdiction, and raising the cost itself was a form of deterrence. There was a third purpose, and this was diplomatic. Any state with a navy is a state that can send envoys and receive them without asking for anyone's permission. And Hyder's missions to the French court, to the Ottoman Sultan, to the Persian Gulf trading partners, to Oman, all of these things required ships, and now these were ships that raised the Mysorean colors. Ships that arrived in foreign ports as the representatives of a sovereign Mysore, not as passengers on somebody else's vessel. In later years, it was Tipu Sultan who formalized and built upon what Hyder had started. And the document that captures this the most precisely was his Hukumnama of 1796. It was an executive order that established the administrative structure of the Mysore Navy in terms that would not look out of place in the way we understand modern naval bureaucracy. So this Hukumnama created a board of admiralty at Srirangapatna. 11 Miriams, lords of the admiralty, were responsible for strategic direction, financial oversight, procurement, and below them, the Mir Bahars, commanders at sea. The document categorized 30 different warships by class, specified their armament, and prescribed the salaries and rations of every sailor down to the precise weight of rice and salt. It established legal protocols for prize money. It specified the types of timber required for hull repairs at the Mangalore and Honnavar dockyards. Again, this was not some kind of a proclamation of intent. This was an operating manual. It reflected a state that had been building, refining, learning from its naval program for more than 3 decades. The Mysore Navy was a serious matter, and the British took it seriously. All of their correspondence from the Madras Presidency in this period returns repeatedly to the threat posed by Mysore's navy on the western ports. They identified Mangalore specifically as the point of greatest danger, so they launched amphibious operations against it during the First Anglo-Mysore War. They contested it again in the Second Anglo-Mysore War. The fact that the British kept attacking Mangalore tells you something. It tells you that you need to know how seriously they regarded what had been built over there. There is one thread that ran unexpectedly all the way into a famous poem, and this is something that I covered in the previous episodes. And these were the rockets that had been produced in the Taramandalapetes in Bangalore, Srirangapatna, and a couple of other places. So earlier rockets like Chinese, Europeans, and even earlier Indian versions had used casings of bamboo or even hard paper, pressed paper. Iron allowed for greater internal pressure, and greater pressure meant greater range, and greater range changed what a rocket could do on a battlefield. But there was engineering required. There was a reason why the Chinese and the others had bamboo and paper as their rocket casings. It was because these sorts of materials could be more easily handled and required less engineering. Using iron casings, it needed a very specific kind of capability. In fact, these rockets that were studied by the British led to William Congreve examining them and using them in the United States of America. And with that bombardment of using these kinds of rockets, the Congreve rockets on Fort McHenry in Baltimore, that led to the lawyer Francis Scott Key writing a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry that led to it becoming the lyrics of the American national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So from Hyder Ali's arsenal in Bangalore to the skies over Baltimore to the most recognized song in America that every child would learn, this is a thread that a lot of people have not followed, but it is very real, and it connects this city, this state, to the world. And all of this happened because it was possible for Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan to use the navy that they themselves had built. Now, the Mysore Navy did not survive the fall of Srirangapatna. When Tipu Sultan died defending his capital in 1799, the administrative structure that had sustained it collapsed with him. The dockyards on the west coast were abandoned. The fleet was dispersed. The program that had occupied 3 decades of sustained state investment simply ceased to exist. It vanished. But its significance does not rest on whether or not it succeeded. It rests on what it represented. In the 18th century, most Indian states responded to British expansion by negotiating with it, retreating, or aligning with it, or merely pleading. Mysore did something different. It studied the problem, identified the specific mechanisms of British power, maritime dominance, and it built a response to that mechanism. Maybe it wasn't an adequate response or a perfect response, and certainly not one that ultimately prevailed, but it was a coherent, systematic, serious response that worried the British no end. And when I say that, remember that the British were the ultimate naval power in the world. This is what Hyder Ali built on the Canara coast. This is what Tipu Sultan formalized in the Hukamnama of 1796. And that is why the Mysore Navy, little known as it is in history, deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote in history, but as the evidence of what was possible when an Indian state chose to think strategically rather than simply react, chose to think proudly. The war that all of this was preparation for was now very close. The fleet had been built. The arsenals had been stocked. The French alliance was in place. And the British coalition on the other side was forming. The northern Sarkars had been ceded, closed and owned now. The Treaty of Hyderabad had been signed. 2 battalions, 6 cannons committed. And there was a written objective. And that was the fort of Bangalore. Everything that had been built on both sides was about to be tested. In the next episode, I follow the first Anglo-Mysore War and the battle that almost came to Bengaluru's gate and the treaty that humiliated a company that had not yet learned how formidable an opponent Mysore could be. That is coming up next. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.